So it's not as if when I was young that I had ever any intention of doing the work I was doing. It's not I thought about it. In fact, when I was young, I just wanted to be a musician. I studied music, and I wanted to be a jazz musician. My parents, of course, I come from a Jewish family, and so I really had three choices at that point, being a doctor, a lawyer, or a dentist, and ended up defying all of those odds and going into business and became a serial entrepreneur in the Valley because I'm someone who loves to color outside the lines. I'm a bit restless. And so what was nice is that even though I studied music, biochemistry, and economics in school, I've now found a job where I'm actually able to infuse all three of those into a job that I really love. And this is a little bit about kind of the journey that we've taken for that. So as I mentioned, I started a few companies here in the Valley, and then successfully exited them, went into venture capital. So I became an entrepreneur in residence, which meant I had a hunting license and a checkbook to look for new companies. Was successful in finding a company I really liked. We got lucky with that one. And then I was able to take some time off. So I came back to San Diego, where I was coaching and mentoring startup companies through a local accelerator called Connect. And it was quite rewarding. Because you had passionate entrepreneurs, but the term incubator wasn't really much in vogue 20 years ago. It wasn't really that widespread. But there were a lot of places around the world that were coming to San Diego and wanting to kind of understand the model of these incubations. And we actually were able to create an advisory practice called Global Connect, which we helped to build 57 programs in 25 countries around the world, helping people build these kind of incubation models. But we learned a lot in doing so. And the culmination of that is this talk, which is, why is innovation so hard? Well, what we found is that a lot of books have been written about innovation. I had been reading a lot of these books, whether it was Clay Christensen or Michael Porter or people like Mary Walshock in San Diego. And I asked them, if you've been writing about this topic for 15, 20 years, why haven't more places been able to take advantage of your knowledge and apply it in a way to make more innovation happen? And even once we actually do get the knowledge, why do we actually fail to implement it? And if we can implement it, how do we make more of it happen? And so that's what really got me started on this whole quest of understanding the complexity of innovation. Because what we learned is that there really is a gap between knowing what we're supposed to do to make innovation happen and actually doing it. And it seems like it would be quite simple, because knowing what to do exists in the mind, doing something exists in the fingertip, and we think it's a very linear correlation, that we just think that we should do something, therefore we do it. But actually, human beings are quite complicated, and we're emotional beings, and we're in some ways emotionally selfish. And we like to do those things that make us feel good, and we try to avoid those things which make us feel bad. And so everything kind of gets processed through our hearts. And so even though we may know we're supposed to do something like get enough rest and eat certain foods and get lots of exercise, certain other behaviors just tend to feel good, and it's no different with innovation. In fact, human beings are the only species with the ability for prospective thought. You know, we can think about the future, and we can feel differently in the present for what will come. So that's why we buy lottery tickets. You know, we buy a lottery ticket, and in that moment we hold that lottery ticket, we actually feel pretty good because we're creating pictures in our head of all the wonderful things we're going to do with the money from that. Well, as positive as that works, it also works in reverse. When we know we have to have a difficult conversation with a loved one or potentially a business colleague, we tend to dread it. We tend to avoid it, and our whole body language changes, and in some ways we try to avoid it or minimize it as much as possible. So we learned that this gap is very real and very, very present, and what we then had to figure out is, how do we get over this knowing-doing gap? So we came up with this model that we're going to describe based on what we saw businesses doing in the 19th and 20th century, but really also what we've seen happening now with the introduction of new technologies and the speed of the knowledge economies and creative economies. We noticed that there were new models being present. And the first part describes what we had observed for agrarian industrial paradigms. So this is a big way of saying companies that are based on mindsets of scarcity. So when we work in traditional resource economies, we have a finite amount of resources to work with. And we have to be very, very careful about how we allocate them. Because anything we do that corrupts that minimizes the outcome of what we're doing. A great way to explain that is if I have an apple and you have an orange, and we share that apple and orange, no matter, first of all, what we do, and we pass those around this room, we'll always have the equivalent of one apple and one orange. But if we decide to consume that apple and orange, it goes down to 0. So we've now taken 2 finite resources, and as we utilize them, we take them down to 0. That's actually pretty scary for us, because then we begin thinking about, wow, we better be careful. If this needs to last us a couple of weeks, we have to ration the apple and orange. We need to make sure to do everything we can to make sure we do the most with the resources we have. And so these are the kinds of models we built. We call them plantations, but as you can see, they're nice, linear, they're perfect, because in the perfection, we optimize the outcome. We know exactly what we're supposed to be doing, and anything that's not supposed to be there, we take out. So if a weed grows up in our vineyard, we pull it out because it doesn't belong there. In fact, it competes for the very resources we want. So at the end of the day, the way we're measured is based on how productive we are, how efficient we are, how scalable we are, and eventually how profitable we are. And that's wonderful in this type of economy. And we've seen this model played out over and over again, from the way we produce automobiles to the military-industrial complex. But even the way we make chips today is not all that much difference. It wastes the fewest number of resources. We get the best yields. We get the best outcomes. And the mindset around all of this is thou shalt not make mistakes. So when we go to school, all the skills we learn is how do we minimize the number of mistakes we make. That's what we're trying to do. But we were seeing a different competing model going on at the same time. This was the knowledge and creative economies. And rather than being built on mindsets of scarcity, we actually saw that they were built on mindsets of abundance. So you and I get together for coffee at a local coffee shop, and I have an idea and you have an idea, and we each share those ideas. Something interesting happens. We now each have 2 ideas. And if we do that within an entire community, we keep compounding the value we're creating, and the capacity of what we're doing actually goes to infinity. It's the exact opposite of what we saw in the industrial paradigm. Instead of taking resources to 0, we actually infinitely increase the amount of resources we have. And it was when I read this from Matt Ridley that it really all made sense, that innovation is all about ideas having sex. And that was a big moment for me, because I realized that really what our job was as entrepreneurs, as innovators, is to promote the promiscuity of ideas. We build the brothels of innovation, the places where we can create these orgies of ideas so that we can make more happen. And that's really was a big insight for us, and we call these models Rainforest. Now, when you look at this rainforest, it seems lush and dense, but you can't tell me what the product is because we can't identify it. It all looks good, it all looks equal, it all looks interesting. And what's interesting, even more interesting, is that the most important thing in that rainforest is probably the weed you're standing on. These are the Googles and Facebooks of the world. These are the companies that everyone passes on initially because they don't look like they're supposed to be there. In fact, they threaten the very system that they're introduced into. And not only do these ideas look strange, the people who run these companies look even stranger. They really do. These do not look like the next people who are going to change the world. And so we ask yourself, if you met this young person, would you recognize this person as a potential future leader, a disruptor, someone who will change the world, someone who will change your very existence and way of doing things? And the answer is we don't. And therein lies the paradox of innovation. The paradox of innovation is that innovation is only validated and accepted once it becomes imitation. It's always measured retrospectively through the rearview mirror rather than prospectively looking forward. Not only that, innovation is the social equivalent of a genetic mistake. When it first presents itself, it threatens the system that it's trying to help. It looks like a virus, and systems do against viruses what they're supposed to do. They try to kill them off. Our job is to try to figure out how to protect these ideas and make them bigger. And what's interesting is over history, whenever you've gone to the experts to ask them what the next big innovations are, they rarely get it right because they're using their existing knowledge to try to predict forward patterns. And it's very hard to do, whether it's the introduction of the telephone, the airplane, or even the personal computer. We get it wrong time after time after time. So what we realize is that imagination is a lot more important than knowledge, because the knowledge we need to actually solve our future problems probably doesn't yet exist. And the only way we're going to do it is by getting out of our chairs, out of this room, going out into the world and experimenting and figuring what we need to know. And it's in that new knowledge that we're going to solve the greatest problems of the world. So instead of the first model of not making mistakes, we shouldn't be teaching children that. We should be teaching them, how do I solve problems? Because if you're good at solving problems, you can take on anything. So this is a case study that we did where I heard Sanjay Jha giving a talk about the Droid phone and the introduction of the Droid. And he was fascinated and a bit annoyed with the success of the iPhone. He could not understand why people love their iPhones, because as an engineering company, they saw it as a somewhat inferior device. And so how is it that an inferior device could actually dominate a market in such a way? And he gave the iPhone to his engineers. They took it apart. They built the first Droid. They put it out into the market. Oh, and by the way, for those of you who don't remember, Motorola owned the handset market prior to this with their Razr. For many years, Motorola was the dominant factor in mobile telephones. Now, all of a sudden, you had smartphones and you had iPhone coming in, so he gave it to his engineers, and they came out with the Droid. And everyone went, it's okay. People would still line up for a new iPhone rather than walk into a store and buy a superior piece of technology. And he said it wasn't until years later why he realized that that had happened. Is because for an engineering company, everything was an engineering problem that then got designed. But for someone like Steve Jobs, everything was actually a design problem that was then engineered. And that is how Steve Jobs was able to create a religion within Apple to where everyone in the world acts like his employee without having to be put on the payroll. Everyone approaches the ownership of their products with a zeal, with an emotional context that belies the actual technology itself. In fact, if you actually go back to the early advertising campaigns of Apple, both the 1984 campaign and the Think Different campaign, they don't even bother talking about the product. They end up talking about their belief system, about what their religion is at Apple. And people subscribe to that religion. And that really touches because all innovation is actually human-centric, not institution-centric. And so we often think that in order to make something happen, we need to understand what the outcome and what the action necessary to achieve that outcome is, and that's where we always tend to focus. But in reality, all actions are a deconstruction of behaviors, attitudes, motivations, and eventually beliefs. And if we can figure out how to change the beliefs of people, what they truly feel and believe hard at their core, then you can get people to do things on a much more sustainable and scalable way. And herein lies the real context of how to make innovation happen. Because for those who believe no evidence is necessary, but for those who do not, no evidence you will ever give them will ever be enough. So create a different belief system, and that will be. But what does it really take to build a belief system? Well, when we work with regions, they often say, well, the reason we're not more innovative is because we don't like taking risk, we don't like being judged, it doesn't feel good when we don't succeed. And we're going, guess what? First of all, get over it. But guess what? Nobody does. It's not inherently in our nature to like not to feel good. So we often let fear dominate our emotional beliefs. And we think that fear is the most powerful emotion. But in reality, hope is the most powerful emotion. The belief that you can actually do something better. And that's that whole idea when you buy the lottery ticket. It creates hope. In that moment, you can imagine a future that is different. You can imagine your role in that future that is different. But you can get an emotional dividend in the present of what it's going to feel like when you actually get there. And that is really the difference of places like Silicon Valley versus other places. And so really we understand that it's actually thinking plus feeling is what is believing. So we often hear, we just have to get a different mindset in our corporation, or have a mindset in a different community. And it's not that at all, because just thinking different is not nearly enough. And as we learned from the knowing-doing gap, you also have to feel different in order to believe that's different, in order to make it happen. And for those of you who are very scientific, this is just more of a scientific way of looking at it, that basically you have to go from the lower left to the upper right, and that just means you got to get off your butts and get out there and make something happen. This slide didn't come out right, but really what we're saying is that you have to go from a new model of leadership too, where we're going from what we call ecosystem, which are command and control hierarchies that are highly permission-based, to one of ecosystem where everyone plays equal and important roles, and it's more about their timing rather than their title. That people step in and out like a play you would go and see, and it's less about status and hierarchy. So if you want to make more innovation happen, don't think like an economist, rather excuse me, think like a psychologist. If you can get inside the heads of people, if you can figure out what makes gives them purpose, what drives them, what makes them live, they will work for you with their passion. And as Maya Angelou said, long after people will remember what you said or did for them, they're going to remember how you made them feel. Now, with regards to failure, that's the other thing. We don't like failure. We don't accept failure. Failure is also just a mindset. As Edison said, he's never failed. He's just found 10,000 ways not to do something. And that's the way we as entrepreneurs see that. Every time we make a mistake, we don't let it define us. We understand that it refines us because we learn from every experience and we move forward and we use those collectively. So two things that need to happen in order for us to be more innovative, whether you build an incubator or whether you do it within an entire community. You have to understand that you're going to be a little ambiguous and you have to have discomfort. That's the only way innovation actually happens, because it's only when we're uncomfortable that we're going to go to seek new answers. And it's only in that we're going to, when we're uncomfortable, that we're going to try to figure out what is wrong. And of course, don't be afraid of pissing people off, because there's a direct correlation between the impact you're going to have and the number of people you're going to eventually piss off. The other rules that you need to understand is that if you want to solve the greatest problems, don't always ask the experts. They're very important because they have wonderful knowledge, as we said, but the best answers are going to come from those who are uninformed and intelligent, because it's in that diversity, it's in that conflict, it's in that debate where all the good stuff is going to come out. And by the way, don't be afraid of innovation smugglers within your organizations. These are the people who carry the good ideas across enemy lines and kind of make things happen. And all organizations have them, whether you realize it or not. So I hate the term thinking outside the box. Absolutely hate it. Because if you talk to enough entrepreneurs, you realize that there actually is no box. There never was. And if you want to solve these problems, you have to realize that there aren't any constraints, and that's the way you need to approach the problem. So the new paradigm we're looking to serve is you need to move away from espousing orthodoxy to practicing orthopraxy, to living the orthopraxy. We follow those who actually practice what they say they do through their leadership styles, as opposed to the do as I say and not as I do model, and not being afraid of risk and not being afraid of failure. So we've combined these all into a set of rules of the rainforest, so to speak. And the first one is, don't be afraid to be a little bit naughty, to break the rules and to be creative and dream. But my favorite one on this list is number 5, which is always think fairness, not advantage, because none of us is able to accurately predict the future. And so the best we can do is go into something that's fair, knowing that we're all going to benefit if we go forward. And the tools we're going to use for building these rainforests are, again, learn by doing. The knowledge we need to solve these problems doesn't exist. Let's go out and create this knowledge together. Let's do it with a lot of people who think differently than us, but also have different life experiences than us, because they're the ones who are going to get us to think and are going to probably help us to solve the problems in the right way. And let's celebrate our role models. When we have people who've done incredible stuff, let's tell their stories. Let's be the carriers of this inspiration. And let's create and empower our social feedback and make these social contracts with each other more explicit. So what I don't want to give people the impression that it's an either-or model, that we completely abandon this kind of plantation model of production. All societies need that, because eventually we need to produce things to get them out. What we're talking about is trying to find that harmonic balance between order and chaos. Because as it says here, without order, nothing can exist, but without chaos, nothing will be able to evolve. So really what we're doing is trying to find that quick balance, but also trying to find a way of inspiring each and every one of you to get out of this room and cause a little bit more chaos than you have been before. So what was asked of me before this is just to talk, and we've just got a little bit of time, to talk about some of the case studies or some of the things that we're seeing going forward that will be changing the world. Reverse incubators are becoming quite popular now. What these are is as opposed to traditional incubators, where we take nascent ideas with teams around them, developing their products and pushing them out to the market. Reverse incubators start with just a bunch of smart people but no product. And corporations and societies bring their problems to these groups of people, and we all kind of help solve these problems together, whether in the form of a grand challenge, whether in the form of some kind of a hackathon. But the most important thing is the testing, the iterating, the evolution of them, and the implementation of these ideas. And of course, social purpose movements are becoming quite important. The use of analytics is a big driver. We're actually using a lot of micro-narrative analysis. We're actually able to go into communities and map the stories. Think of this when you go into a city and you talk to cab drivers or baristas or people in hotels. The stories that they tell you a lot about the community and where it's going. We're just now officially capturing some of these micro-narratives, and we're able to tell with a very high degree of accuracy how innovative a place is or is not based on those stories we're hearing. And really understanding that as much as your technologies are exciting, people are by far the most important intellectual property you can create. So thank you.
Wow.